The cashier saw him the moment he walked in, worn, hoodie-scuffed shoes, no watch worth noticing, and she had already made up her mind before he reached the counter. She charged him a service fee that didn't exist, handed him a plate of cold food, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and when he quietly asked why he was being treated differently from every other customer in the room, she picked up the phone and called the police. What she didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that the man standing at her counter owned every single one of these restaurants. And the next few minutes would change everything. Cole Harrison had been doing this long enough to know exactly what he was looking for. Not spreadsheets, not quarterly reports, not the kind of numbers that looked clean on paper because someone upstream had made sure they would. What he was looking for couldn't be found in a boardroom, and it couldn't be faked when the right person was watching. It only showed up in the small moments, the way a server refilled a glass without being asked, the way a manager handled a complaint at 7 in the morning when the dining room was loud and everyone was tired. The small moments were where the truth lived. That was why every few months Cole picked a location from the morning grill roster and drove out alone. No advance notice, no company car. He wore whatever was hanging near the back of his closet, a faded gray hoodie that had seen too many winters, a pair of work boots with the left toe starting to separate at the sole, and he walked in like any other man who needed coffee and eggs before the day started. He had built the chain from a single location in Savannah into something that stretched across more than 30 cities in the South. But on mornings like this one, he looked like someone who might have trouble covering the bill. He pulled his older sedan into the parking lot of the Morning Grill on Clifton Road, just after 8 on a Saturday. The lot was nearly full. Through the front window, he could see the dining room moving servers weaving between tables, the flash of plates coming out of the pass through the particular kind of controlled chaos that a busy weekend breakfast looked like from the outside. He sat in the car for a moment and watched the way he always did. He had learned more from parking lots than from most meetings. Inside, the smell was right coffee and butter, and something on the griddle, and for a moment it was almost enough to make him feel the way he used to feel when the whole thing was still just one room with 8 tables and a sign he'd painted himself. He had opened Morning Grill the year after his wife passed, not because it was the right time to start a business, but because he needed somewhere to put his hands and his hours. The work had saved him in ways he had never fully explained to anyone. The values he built it on were simple: treat every person who walked through the door like they mattered, regardless of what they were wearing or how they paid. It was not a complicated idea, but it was the one he had never been willing to compromise on. He joined the line at the host stand and waited. 2 couples ahead of him were greeted warmly and walked to their tables. When Cole reached the counter, the cashier on duty looked up from her screen, took one look at him, and her expression shifted in a way that was subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Cole did not miss it. Her name tag read Tiffany. She was in her late 20s, sharp-featured with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked a register long enough to size up customers before they opened their mouths. She did not say good morning. She looked back at her screen and began entering something slowly, the way people move when they want you to feel like you are an inconvenience. "Table for 1, Cole said. Tiffany typed without looking up. "There's a seating fee on weekends for single-party reservations, $5. Cole had reviewed every policy across every location in the last fiscal year. There was no such fee. There had never been such a fee. He kept his face neutral and reached into his pocket. He paid without comment, and she slid a menu across the counter with 2 fingers, the way you might pass something to someone you didn't want to touch. He was seated at a 2-top near the back, the table closest to the kitchen entrance, where the foot traffic was constant, and the ambient noise made it hard to hold a thought. Around him, the rest of the dining room had better placement couples by the window, a group of older men at a round table in the center, a few families spread across the booth section along the far wall. Cole noted who had been seated where. He noted how long it took for a server to appear at his table versus the others nearby. It took 11 minutes. The server who eventually came was young and nervous, and clearly not the problem. She took his order, 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee, and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Cole set his phone on the table face down and watched the room. He watched the way Tiffany handled the customers who came in after him, a couple in athletic wear, who were greeted with a genuine smile, a man in a sport coat who was walked personally to a window table by the shift manager Cole had already identified as the one in charge of the floor. The shift manager's name tag read Ryan. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered with the kind of confidence that came not from competence, but from having operated unchallenged for long enough that the two had started to feel like the same thing. Cole had seen the type before. Ryan moved through the dining room like he owned it, which meant he had forgotten or never bothered to learn that someone else actually did. Cole's coffee arrived after 14 minutes. It was lukewarm. He didn't send it back. When his food came, he looked at it for a moment before picking up his fork. The eggs had the flat, dry look of something that had been sitting in a warming tray instead of coming fresh off the griddle. The toast was cold at the center. The plate had the particular quality of food that had been prepared at one point, set aside, and then sent out when a table needed filling. He ate a few bites and set his fork down. He was not there to eat. He was there to watch. And what he was watching was getting harder to look at the longer he sat. At the table to his left, an older man in a work jacket had been waiting for nearly 20 minutes for a refill that never came. At the table directly behind Cole, a woman eating alone, a food worker's apron still folded over her bag, had been handed a check before she'd finished her plate, something Cole had explicitly banned as a practice across every location because of what it communicated to the person sitting there. And near the front of the room, he could see Ryan leaning against the host stand beside Tiffany, the two of them speaking quietly, and then both of them looking in Cole's direction and laughing at something between themselves. Cole had been doing this long enough not to react. He picked up his coffee cup and held it like he wasn't watching anything at all. It was the woman who changed everything. She came from the direction of the kitchen, middle-aged in a cook's apron that was clean, despite the hour moving quickly and deliberately, like someone who didn't have time to waste, but had decided to waste it anyway, because something needed to be said. She stopped at Cole's table and leaned down slightly, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past the immediate area. Her name tag read, Gloria. She looked at him with the directness of someone who had been in the industry long enough to spot things that didn't fit, and Cole Harrison sitting quietly at the worst table in the house, with a plate of cold food and a lukewarm coffee, apparently did not fit. You should know, Gloria said, that what you're eating isn't what was made for you. The order that came in for table 9 was rerouted. What you got was from a return that should have been thrown out. She kept her hands folded in front of her, her voice, even like she was giving him information, and leaving it entirely up to him what to do with it. That's not an accident. That's a decision. Cole looked at her steadily. Has this happened before? Gloria's expression did not change, but something in it settled, like she had been waiting for someone to ask that exact question for a long time. Complaints have been filed, she said. More than a few. They don't go anywhere. Ryan handles the reports before they make it up the chain, and the area manager isn't the type to look too hard at locations that hit their weekly numbers. She glanced toward the front of the room, where Ryan had moved away from the host stand and was now speaking with a table near the window. The people he goes after are always the same kind of people. The ones he figures won't come back, won't make noise, and don't have anybody looking out for them. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate, then at the dining room, then at Gloria, who was already straightening up like she had somewhere to be, and had said everything she intended to say. You're taking a risk telling me this, Cole said. Gloria shrugged once, the kind of shrug that wasn't indifference, but something closer to a decision that had already been made. I've been cooking in this industry for 22 years, she said. I know what this place is supposed to be, and right now, it isn't that. She walked back toward the kitchen without looking at Tiffany or Ryan, and she did not look back. Cole sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the parking lot was still filling up. Through the window, he could see another family getting out of a minivan, a couple both in weekend clothes moving toward the entrance, the way people did when they were expecting a decent meal and a little bit of ordinary peace on a Saturday morning. They had no idea what the room they were about to walk into actually was, or who was running it, or what it cost to sit at the wrong table. Cole had two options, and he understood both of them clearly. He could stand up, walk out, and write it up the same way he had written up other locations. A report filed through Evelyn's office, a meeting scheduled, a process initiated. Clean, controlled, and almost certainly ineffective because Ryan had already shown that he knew how to make reports disappear before they reached anyone who would act on them. Or he could stay. He set his coffee cup down. He straightened slightly in his chair and looked at the dining room. Really looked at it with the eyes of someone who had built it and who had, until this morning, believed it stood for something specific. The older man with the empty cup was still waiting for a refill. The woman with the apron on her bag had already left her half-eaten plate abandoned on the table. And near the front, Tiffany was greeting a new couple at the counter with the full warmth of someone who had clearly made a judgment about them the moment they walked through the door. Cole had built Morning Grill on a single principle that the quality of your service could not be conditional. That the person in the work boots and the worn jacket deserved exactly the same experience as the person in the sport coat. Not because it was good business, though it was, but because the alternative was something he refused to be a part of. He had been clear about that from the beginning. He had said it in every training, put it in every handbook, spoken about it in every all-hands meeting he had ever stood in front of. And while he had been out there saying it, this had been happening inside one of his own restaurants for over a year. He was not leaving. He pulled out his phone, sent a single text message, 7 words, no context, to Logan Brooks, and set it back down face first on the table. Then he picked up what was left of his cold coffee, settled back in his chair, and waited to see what Ryan and Tiffany would do next when they realized the man at table 9 wasn't going anywhere. The next hour moved the way bad things often do, gradually, then all at once. Cole stayed at his table and did what he had come to do. He watched. He kept his posture relaxed, his phone face down, his expression the blank and patient look of a man with nowhere urgent to be. To anyone glancing over, he was just another customer sitting too long over a meal he had mostly left untouched. But Cole was cataloging everything the way he had trained himself to do over years of these visits, building a picture not from any single moment, but from the accumulation of small ones. The older man in the work jacket, the one who had been waiting on a refill since before Cole's food arrived, eventually raised his hand to flag down a server. The server who came was not the one assigned to his section. She was passing through, already carrying plates for another table, and she stopped only because the man's arm was directly in her path. She refilled his cup quickly and moved on. The man thanked her with the particular gratitude of someone who had been waiting long enough to feel the weight of being overlooked, and Cole watched him wrap both hands around the warm cup like it was more than just coffee. Across the room, a table of 4 had received their check, while 2 of them were still eating. Cole had seen it happen once already with the woman in the food service apron, and he recognized it for what it was, a quiet way of telling certain customers that their time at the table was done. Not everyone knew to read it that way, but that didn't make the message any less deliberate. The table of 4 looked at the check, then at each other, and without another word, they began gathering their things. They left a small tip. They did not look like people who would come back. Cole turned his attention to the register. From where he sat, he had a partial view of the counter, enough to see the screen Tiffany was working from, and the way transactions moved through her hands. What he noticed was not dramatic. It was quiet and practiced, and very easy to miss if you weren't looking for it specifically. A customer in paint-stained pants ordered coffee and a short stack. The total Tiffany quoted him was $4 more than the menu price Cole had memorized. The man paid without blinking either, because he didn't track prices closely, or because he had learned at some point not to question things like that. And Tiffany closed the transaction with the same neutral efficiency she applied to everything else. A few minutes later, Cole watched Ryan approach the counter and exchange a brief word with Tiffany. Ryan glanced at the register display, said something that made Tiffany smile, and then moved away. Nothing about the exchange was overtly suspicious, but Cole had been in the restaurant business long enough to understand what that kind of easy, unguarded communication between a cashier and a shift manager looked like when the register was being used as a private income stream. It looked exactly like that. By the time Cole had been sitting for nearly 90 minutes, he had a clear enough picture. The overcharges were targeted, applied to customers who fit a certain profile, who were less likely to scrutinize their bills or escalate a complaint. The food quality was manipulated the same way, with the worst of what came out of the kitchen routed selectively to the tables. Ryan and Tiffany had already decided didn't matter, and the complaints that had been filed, the ones Gloria had mentioned, had never made it past Ryan's desk, which meant that every person who had spoken up about what was happening here had been met with silence and continued coming back to a place that was taking advantage of them. Cole stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward the counter dramatically or position himself for effect. He simply stood at his table and spoke at a volume that was clear without being loud, the kind of tone that carries across a room, not because it is forceful, but because it is entirely certain of itself. "I'd like to ask something," Cole said, "and I'd like an honest answer." The server nearest to him stopped moving. Two customers at the adjacent table looked over. The natural noise of the dining room didn't stop all at once, but it shifted the way ambient sound does when something in a space changes register. Cole looked directly at Ryan, who had turned from the window booth he'd been attending, and was now watching Cole with the flat, evaluating expression of someone who had handled disruptions before and was already categorizing this one. Cole kept his gaze level and steady. "Is this how you treat all your customers?" Cole said. "Or just the ones you've decided aren't worth the effort?" The question landed in a way that made the room go quiet. It wasn't an accusation framed as outrage. It didn't have the quality of a man losing his composure. It was the kind of question that arrives already fully formed, specific enough to mean something calm enough that it couldn't be easily dismissed as emotional, and several people in the dining room seemed to feel the weight of it before anyone had said another word. The older man with his coffee cup set it down slowly. A woman at a nearby booth looked up from her phone. Ryan crossed the floor in a few long strides. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who was accustomed to being in charge of situations like this and had already decided how this one was going to end. "Sir," Ryan said, his voice carrying the thin, controlled courtesy of a man who was not feeling courteous at all, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your tone." "I haven't raised it," Cole said. Ryan stopped about 3 feet away. "You're disrupting my dining room." "I'm standing at my table," Cole said. "I ordered food that came from a warming tray. I was charged a service fee that isn't on your menu, and I've spent the last hour watching you and your cashier apply a different standard to customers based on how they're dressed." He kept his hands at his sides, his voice at the same steady, unhurried pitch. "I'm not disrupting anything. I'm asking a question." Ryan's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "You need to leave," he said. "Right now. Or I'm calling the police." Cole did not move. "I'll wait," he said. What Ryan had not accounted for, what neither he nor Tiffany had anticipated, was that Cole's refusal to leave would be so entirely without agitation. An angry customer was something Ryan knew how to manage. A man who stood quietly and waited was something different, and it introduced an uncertainty into the situation that Ryan clearly did not know what to do with. He looked at Cole for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the counter with the stiff precision of someone performing confidence they were no longer fully feeling. Tiffany already had her phone in her hand. She made the call quickly, speaking in a low voice that Cole couldn't hear from across the room, and from the brief performance of distress she put on. While speaking, her free hand pressed to her sternum, her face arranged into something that suggested fear. It was clear she was not calling to report a complaint. She was calling to report a threat. Several customers had their phones out by this point. Cole noticed it the way he noticed most things, steadily without reacting. A man 2 tables over had his screen angled toward the counter area and was filming in the unhurried way of someone who had watched enough situations like this unfold online to recognize one in real life. A woman near the window had her phone raised more openly. Neither of them were being theatrical about it. They were just documenting, the way people did now when something in a public space crossed a threshold they felt needed a witness. Ryan had returned to the floor and was moving between tables with a performance of normalcy that convinced no one. His jaw was still set. He spoke briefly to a server near the kitchen pass-through, who nodded and disappeared. He did not look at Cole directly again, but Cole could feel the calculation happening from across the room. Ryan was running through his options, and Cole understood that Ryan still believed on some level that this was a situation his position could resolve. He had handled things before. He had made reports go away before. He had the area manager's ear, and that had been enough every single time. What Ryan did not know was that Cole had sent 7 words to Evelyn Brooks nearly 2 hours ago, and Evelyn Brooks did not wait. The 2 officers who arrived were professional and unhurried. They came through the front door and went straight to the counter, where Tiffany met them with the composed version of whatever performance she had been building since she made the call. Cole watched from his table as she spoke to them, animated her hands, moving her expression arranged into the particular combination of worry and relief that communicated I was frightened, and now I'm safe. He watched one of the officers write something in a small notebook. He watched Ryan appear at Tiffany's side, lending the weight of his position to the account she was giving. Cole remained at his table. One of the officers crossed the room and stopped at Cole's table. He was polite and direct, the way good officers were when they were responding to something they hadn't fully assessed yet. He explained that a complaint had been filed about a disturbance. He asked Cole if he wouldn't mind stepping outside to discuss it. Cole looked at the officer calmly. "I'm not going to step outside," he said. "But I'm happy to discuss it here." He kept his hands visible on the table and his voice entirely without aggression. "What I will tell you is that what you were told about this situation is not accurate, and that in approximately the next few minutes, you're going to have a clearer picture of what actually happened this morning." The officer studied him for a moment, reading him the way experienced officers read people looking for the signs that told you what kind of situation you were actually in. Whatever he found in Cole's face, it was enough to make him take a step back and wait rather than escalate. At the front of the room, Tiffany was watching Cole with a new expression. Now, not the casual contempt from earlier, but something closer to the early stages of worry. Ryan was standing beside her arms, crossed, projecting an authority that was already beginning to look like a posture rather than a fact. He was still operating on the assumption that this would resolve the same way it always had. The complaint filed, the customer removed the paperwork handled, everything back to the version of normal that served him. Then the front door opened. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb outside. Cole had heard the engine through the brief quiet of the dining room, and the woman who walked through the door walked the way people walked when they were arriving with a purpose, and didn't need to announce it. Evelyn Brooks was in her mid-40s trim and precise in a dark jacket, and she came in with 2 people behind her, who had the particular unhurried stillness of the company's legal team. She scanned the room in 2 seconds, found Cole at the back table, and moved toward him without looking at Ryan or Tiffany or the officers at all. The room had gone nearly silent. Cole reached into the front pocket of his hoodie. He removed a small flat device, a camera the kind designed to look like nothing at all, positioned in the fabric where it had been recording clearly for the past 2 hours. He set it on the table between himself and Evelyn, and then he looked up at the room. He looked at Ryan, who had gone very still. He looked at Tiffany, whose hand had dropped away from the counter. He looked at the officer who had come to his table, and at the customers near the windows, with their phones still raised, and at Gloria, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway and was standing with her arms folded across her chest and her expression carrying the particular quiet of someone who had already known how this needed to end. "My name is Cole Harrison," he said, and his voice carried across the silent room without effort. "I'm the founder and owner of Morning Grill, every location, including this one." He kept his eyes on Ryan as he said it, not to punish him with the information, but because Ryan was the one who needed to understand it most completely. "Everything that happened in this dining room this morning has been recorded. The service charges that don't exist on any menu, the food that was rerouted from a warming tray to my table, the pattern of treatment applied to customers based on their appearance, and the call made to these officers based on a description of events that did not happen." He looked at Evelyn, who gave one short nod. "We're going to have a conversation about all of it. Right here." The dining room did not move. Ryan's arms had come uncrossed at some point, and he was standing with them at his sides now, and the expression on his face had traveled a long distance from where it had started that morning. Tiffany had set her phone down on the counter and was looking at it rather than at Cole. The officer with the notebook had stopped writing and was watching the scene with the careful attention of someone recalibrating what kind of call he had actually responded to. Outside, the Saturday morning continued as if nothing had changed. Cars moved through the lot. A couple walked toward the entrance slowed when they saw the SUV at the curb and decided to wait. Inside, every person in the Morning Grill on Clifton Road understood, without anyone having to say it plainly, that the version of this place they had walked into that morning no longer existed. The investigation began before the SUV had finished cooling in the parking lot. Evelyn's team moved through the Clifton Road location with the focused efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this kind of situation and were not surprised by what they found. Transaction records were pulled. Register logs were cross-referenced against printed menu pricing. Shift schedules were matched to complaint timestamps that had been filed through the corporate feedback system over the previous 14 months. Complaints that should have triggered reviews, that should have generated follow-up calls, that should have at minimum put this location on a watch list. Instead, they had arrived at Ryan's desk and stopped there. Every single one of them. Cole sat with Evelyn at a table near the back of the dining room while her team worked. The officers had remained on site long enough to understand what they were actually looking at, and one of them had made a second call quieter than the first, less routine, before they settled in to wait alongside the legal team. Ryan had been separated from Tiffany early in the process, which was standard. Both of them had stopped speaking almost immediately, which told Cole everything he needed to know about how clearly they understood their position. Neither of them had left the building. What the records showed took the better part of 2 hours to fully map, but the shape of it became clear within the first 30 minutes. The overcharges were not random. They followed a pattern that was specific enough to be intentional and consistent enough to have generated real money over time. Not the kind of number that made headlines, but enough spread across months to represent a significant and sustained theft from people who had trusted that the price on the menu was the price they would be charged. The register had been the instrument. Ryan had been the architect. Tiffany had been the mechanism. And the area manager, a man Cole had personally hired 4 years ago because he had seemed dependable and detail-oriented, had been the wall that kept everything contained. Cole sat with that for a long time, not because it shocked him. He had been in business long enough to know that every system, no matter how carefully built, had the capacity to be corrupted by the people inside it. What stayed with him was something different. The specific image of the man in the work jacket waiting for a coffee refill that never came. The woman with the apron folded over her bag being handed a check before she'd finished eating. The quiet way people absorbed that kind of treatment when they had decided somewhere along the way that speaking up wasn't worth the effort. those people had come to Morning Grill because it was supposed to be different. And for more than a year, it had failed them in a way that Cole had not known about, because the right safeguards hadn't been in place to ensure that he would. That was the part that belonged to him. He didn't look away from it. By mid-afternoon, the video had found its way online. One of the customers who had been filming near the window had posted it before noon, a 4-minute clip that began with Cole standing at his table and asking his question, and ended with Evelyn walking through the door and Cole identifying himself to the room. The clip didn't have the shaky, accidental quality of most phone footage. Whoever had filmed it had held their hand steady and kept the frame wide, which meant the context was visible: the dining room, the officers, the expression on Ryan's face as the words settled over him. By early evening, the clip had been shared widely enough that Morning Grill became a trending topic in the regional news cycle. By the following morning, it had reached national outlets. The coverage was not uniformly favorable. Some of it was the narrative of an owner going undercover to hold his own staff accountable, had a clean, satisfying shape that lent itself to a certain kind of story. But some of the coverage asked harder questions, the kind Cole thought were fair and necessary. How had this gone on for over a year without detection? What did it say about the oversight structure of the chain that a shift manager could suppress customer complaints for 14 months without anyone in a position of authority noticing? What did it mean that the customers most affected had been precisely the ones with the least institutional recourse, the ones who paid in cash, who didn't leave reviews online, who had learned not to expect much from the places they spent their money? Cole read all of it. He did not have his communications team draft a response that answered only the comfortable parts. He sat with Evelyn and the legal team for 3 days, and they built a response that addressed the actual questions, including the ones that reflected poorly on the organization's internal structure. He did not enjoy those conversations. He thought they were necessary. Ryan Mercer was terminated within 24 hours of the investigation's initial findings. Tiffany Walker was terminated the same day. Both terminations were immediate and without severance, based on documented evidence of financial fraud, willful misconduct, and the filing of a false police report. The area manager was placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of his conduct over the prior 14 months. Cole already knew, based on what Evelyn's team had found in the communication records between Ryan and the area manager, that the leave would not last long and would not end in reinstatement. That process moved through the proper channels at its own pace, and Cole led it. The criminal referral took slightly longer to formalize, but it was filed. The district attorney's office in Savannah received a complete package of documentation, transaction records, register logs, the recorded footage, the suppressed complaint files, and a timeline constructed by the legal team that laid out the pattern clearly enough that it required very little interpretation. Cole was told the process would take time. He understood that. He was not in the business of predicting how courts moved. He was in the business of making sure the right information was in the right hands, and that part was done. What came next was not a single decision, but a series of them made over the following weeks, with the kind of deliberate attention Cole had not applied to operations infrastructure in several years. Not because he had stopped caring, but because he had trusted a structure that had turned out to have a critical gap in it. The gap was simple. There was no mechanism for frontline staff at any location to report misconduct directly to corporate leadership without the report passing through intermediate management. Every complaint, every concern, every observation from someone like Gloria had to travel through the same chain that the problem had corrupted. That was not a small design flaw. It was the reason this had been able to continue as long as it had. Cole rebuilt that system from the foundation. An independent reporting line was established, separate from normal HR channels, managed by a third-party firm that had no relationship to Morning Grill's internal management structure, with guaranteed anonymity and a direct escalation path to Evelyn's office. The line was made available to every employee across every location, and its existence was communicated not through a memo, but through in-person meetings at each site, led by Evelyn and Cole himself at the larger locations. At those meetings, Cole did not stand at a podium and deliver a speech about values. He sat at tables and listened to what people had to say about what they had seen and what had made them feel like saying anything wasn't worth the risk. He heard things at those meetings that were difficult to hear. Not revelations, nothing that rose to the level of what had happened at Clifton Road, but the kind of low-level patterns that existed in organizations where accountability had become something performed rather than practiced. Small compromises that had accumulated over time, shortcuts that had become habits, attitudes that had been allowed to settle, because no one senior enough had been in the room when they showed up. Cole wrote down everything he heard. He did not minimize any of it. The anonymous inspection program was formalized, not the ad hoc system Cole had been running on his own judgment, which depended entirely on him having the time and availability to conduct visits, but a structured program with a dedicated team of experienced evaluators who rotated across locations on a schedule no one at the site level could predict or prepare for. The evaluation criteria were specific and measurable, and the results fed directly into the performance review cycle for every level of management up to and including regional directors. The program cost money. Cole had approved the budget before Evelyn finished presenting it. Training was rebuilt as well. Not the kind of training that consisted of a video module and a signed acknowledgement form, but multi-day sessions that began with a single question Cole had written himself and placed at the top of the first page of every participant workbook. Who is the customer you are most likely to underserve and why? The sessions were mandatory for every manager across the chain, and they were facilitated by people who had spent their careers in hospitality. Ethics, not motivational speakers, not corporate consultants, but practitioners who understood service from the inside and knew how to talk about the gap between stated values and actual behavior without letting anyone in the room pretend the gap wasn't real. Gloria Bennett was offered the position of branch manager at the Clifton Road location 3 weeks after the investigation closed. Evelyn called her directly. She did not frame the offer as a reward because Cole had been explicit about that. He didn't want Gloria to feel as though her role in what happened was being transacted, as though she had traded information for a promotion, and the two things were simply balanced against each other. What Evelyn told her was straightforward. The location needed someone who understood what the restaurant was supposed to be and had already proven at some cost to herself that she cared enough to say something when it wasn't. The offer stood on its own merits. Gloria took 2 days to think about it, which Cole thought was the right amount of time to take. She accepted. She started on a Monday, which was her preference. The months that followed moved the way recovery moved when the work was real, not dramatically. Not with the clean momentum of a story that had a fixed ending point, but gradually and unevenly, with some weeks better than others, and some locations easier than others, and the whole thing requiring more sustained attention than Cole had initially budgeted for. He gave it the attention it required. He kept the visits going, the same worn hoodie, the same sedan, the same early Saturday mornings, because the point of the visits had never been to catch anyone doing something wrong. The point was to stay connected to what the restaurants actually felt like, from the inside, from the seat of someone who had come in without an appointment and without a title and just wanted a decent meal and to be treated like a person. That hadn't changed. On a Saturday morning in late October, Cole drove back to the Clifton Road location. He parked in the same spot where he had parked in the spring, and he sat in the car for a moment the same way he always did. The lot was full. Through the window, the dining room was moving with the particular energy of a place that had found its rhythm, not frantic, not slow, but right. He could see a server at a corner table crouching down to be at eye level with a customer rather than standing over him. He could see Gloria at the host stand, not managing from a distance, but in the room present the way a manager who actually cared about the place was present. Cole got out of the car. He was wearing a suit for the first time in as long as he could remember, walking into one of his own restaurants. And when he came through the front door, Gloria looked up from the host stand and recognized him immediately. She didn't perform surprise or deference. She gave him the same direct level look she had given him across a table 9 months ago when she had decided that something needed to be said, and said it. "Table for one?" she asked. "Please," Cole said. She walked him to a table near the window, a good table with light, and she handed him a menu with both hands, not 2 fingers. The coffee arrived in 4 minutes, hot enough to mean something. The server who brought it greeted him by name, not his name specifically, but the name of a person, which was the only name that mattered, and asked if he was ready to order or needed a few minutes. Cole looked around the dining room. He looked at the man at the counter, who was being handed a receipt that matched exactly what the menu said it would. He looked at the couple in the booth nearest the window, who were laughing at something without any awareness of being observed or evaluated. He looked at the kitchen pass-through, where Gloria was checking a plate before it went out, not perfunctorily, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that the quality of what came off that line was a direct statement about what the place believed in. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he picked up the menu and ordered. A business was not measured by what it said about itself on a sign or in a mission statement, or in the remarks a founder made at an all-hands meeting once a year. It was measured by what happened in its dining room on an ordinary Saturday morning when no one important was watching, or when someone was watching who had been treated as though they weren't. Cole had built Morning Grill to be the kind of place where that distinction didn't exist, where the experience was the same regardless of who was in the chair, where the person who came in alone in a worn jacket got the same coffee, the same food, the same ordinary human decency as anyone else who walked through the door. It had taken a failure to remind him that building something and maintaining it were not the same work. They required different kinds of attention, and the second kind never ended. He understood that now in a way that he hadn't fully understood it before, and he thought that was probably the most honest thing that could be said about the entire morning on Clifton Road. Not that it had been a victory, but that it had been a correction. A hard, necessary, overdue correction that had cost real people real things before it was made. The only adequate response to that was to make sure the correction held. Cole's food arrived hot. He ate all of it.